Welcome back to Echoes of History. Tonight, we travel to the far northern edge of the Han Empire, to the mountains and plains where the wind never rests and where stone meets the sky. Here, under the quiet rule of night, a lone watchman walks the Great Wall. The year is 120 BC. The world beyond these stones is wild, ungoverned, and vast. The night begins in silence. Only the wind moves. It slides along the battlements in long, whistling breaths, rattling loose bricks. The torches burn low, their flames bowed by the current. Far below, the land spreads out in pale ribbons, frozen river, thin forest, the faint shine of snow across empty fields. The stars hang cold and sharp above it all, as though they too are keeping watch. The soldier's footsteps echo against the stone, steady, deliberate. His fur cloak drags slightly behind him, gathering frost at its hem. His hands, wrapped in cloth, hold a spear that has seen both heat and store. Creaks when he moves. Each sound feels louder in the stillness, as if the night itself is listening. He reaches a brazier left burning at the edge of the parapet. The coals have sunk low, their glow a deep orange buried in ash. He kneels, feeding them dry grass and a few splinters of pine. The fire breathes again, a small, living thing in the frozen dark. He holds his hands above it, feeling the ache of blood returning. Steam rises from his gloves. From the next tower down, a faint sounds. Once, twice, a call not of alarm, but of routine. He lifts his head, listening. The note fades into the wind, then is answered by another farther away. The sound travels along the wall like a slow heartbeat, tower to tower, until it disappears into distance. He exhales and sits beside the fire. The stone beneath him is cold, its surface worn smooth by years of passing boots. He takes a strip of dried meat from his pouch, chews slowly, and looks out across. Stretches endlessly. No lights, no movement. Only the faint gleam of frost catching the torchlight and the dark outline of the hills pressing against the horizon. He remembers when he first came here, the noise of the capital, the smell of incense, the weight of armor newly issued to him. He had imagined glory then, the sound of battle, the name of his family carved into the wood of the barracks gate. But the wall does not offer glory, only time and the slow erosion of thought. He spear against the parapet. The wood is cold to the touch, smooth from use. He looks upward. The stars seem close tonight, as if he could reach out and scatter them with a hand. From below, a faint howl rises, a wolf or perhaps two. The sound wavers, caught by the wind. The soldier listens, not in fear, but with the quiet respect of one creature acknowledging another. He knows they move through the snow along the base of the wall, following the scent of fires and rations. He throws a scrap. Meat over the edge. It falls soundlessly into the dark. The fire beside him flickers, its light painting his armor in slow, uneven movement. He adjusts the strap at his shoulder, pulls his cloak tighter, and stands again. Duty does not allow stillness for long. He resumes his walk, his figure passing in and out of the reach of the torchlight. Behind him, the wall stretches in both directions, endless stone coiling through the mountains, vanishing into haze. Each watchtower burns its torch, a chain of orange lights against the black. Between them, the night is absolute. Hours pass. The moon rises higher, silvering the snow. The wind shifts, colder now, carrying the smell of smoke, distant, faint, unfamiliar. The watchman stops. He turns toward the north, toward the unseen plains. The air hums faintly. He waits, listening. But no sound follows. Only the soft crack of melting frost as it drips from the stones. He exhales again, and the sound disappears. There are thousands of men like him along the wall tonight, scattered across the empire's edge, each tending his small fire, each listening for footsteps that never come. He looks down at the torch in his hand. Its flame bends with the wind, stubborn but alive. He smiles faintly. The smallest light in the world, yet it has kept back the dark for another night. The wind changes again, bringing with it the dry scent of pine from the southern slopes. Somewhere far below, the river has begun to thaw, its surface cracking in the cold, moving beneath its skin of ice. The soldier cannot see it, but he can feel it, deep in the silence, the slow return of motion of life. He leans on his spear, watching the horizon. The stars fade one by one. The sky turns pale above the mountains, and the wall, ancient and endless, begins to glow faintly in the first light of dawn. The soldier lowers his torch. The night has passed, and the world, vast, cold, and patient, has survived. Turns toward the next tower. A horn sounds again, this time not to warn, but to greet the coming day. And so, like the fire he guards, the watchman endures, a single flame along the spine of stone that divides the empire from the silence beyond. The sun rose without warmth. It crept over the ridges in pale light, the kind that revealed everything but offered nothing in return. The snow that lingered on the northern slopes glittered, hard and cold, while the valleys below still lay. The great wall stretched through that half-light like a scar across the earth, a line of stone separating silence from civilization. The watchman stood by the parapet, his breath a faint cloud in the morning air. His eyes followed the wall's curve as it vanished into the haze. He could trace the line of towers by the smoke rising from their fires, thin threads drifting into the still sky. Each column marked a post like his own, each man rising from a sleepless night to begin another day. Endurance. He rubbed his hands together, the sound rough against the cloth wrapping his palms. The cold had not left him. It lived in his bones now, in the small joints of his fingers, in the narrow space between breath and thought. He poured a little water from his flask into a cup and held it above the fire until steam rose. The metal hissed faintly when he drank. Below him, the world began to move. From the barracks tucked into the hollow beside the wall, soldiers emerged, slow, still, wrapped in cloaks the color of dust. They carried bundles of wood, water skins, and the long poles used to check for damage in the stonework. A few led mules along the frozen path. The sound of hooves striking rock carried far in the thin air. A commander in dark armor approached the stairs leading to the tower. The watchman straightened at once, his hand tightening around his spear. When the officer appeared, his face was hidden by the rim of his helmet, his eyes narrowed against the wind. "Quiet night?" he asked. The watchman nodded. "Only the wind and wolves." The commander's gaze turned northward, toward the pale expanse beyond the wall. "That's more than most can say," he murmured. The last outpost reported smoke on the horizon. Could be traders, could be riders. He said nothing more, only watched the distance for a time. Then he placed a hand on the watchman's shoulder. "Keep your fires high," he said. "The light must never fade." When the officer left, the sounder. Boots faded quickly down the stairs. The wind filled the silence behind him. The watchman turned back to the plain. It seemed endless, a white sea of dust and snow. Sometimes in the distance, shadows moved not men or horses, but the tricks of light and wind. The earth here was alive in its own slow way, always shifting, never revealing what it held. He reached into his pouch and took out a small wooden charm. It was worn smooth, the shape of a bird carved from the branch of a sister had given it to him before he left home. He turned it in his hand, feeling the grooves with his thumb. It was the only thing that reminded him he belonged somewhere else. The hours passed. By midday, the sky turned white. The wind had stilled, leaving a silence so wide it seemed to press against the ears. The watchman walked the length of the tower, checking the ropes, the torches, the signal flags. Each one was in place, though the colors had faded from years of sun. At the edge of the parapet he paused. A hawk circled above the valley, motionless but for the tilt of its wings. He watched it glide for a long time. When it vanished into the glare, he returned to the fire, crouched beside it, and closed his eyes. For a few moments, sleep came shallow and dreamless. He woke to the sound of distant thunder, but there were no clouds. The noise came again, deep, rhythmic, deliberate. Hooves. He rose quickly, his hand already on his spear. He turned toward the northern. There, far off, a dark line was moving across the snow, slow, steady, unbroken. Dust rose behind it like breath. He lit the signal torch at once, raising it high so that the smoke coiled into the pale air. A moment later, the next tower's flame answered. Then the next, and the next, fire leaping from tower to tower across the mountains, each light calling to the one beyond it. He waited, his pulse steady. The wall was alive now, a spine of flame cutting through the grey. But again, toward the north, the riders were gone. Only the dust remained, swirling aimlessly in the wind. He stood motionless for a long time, watching. Then he lowered the torch and pressed its base into the snow until the flame died. The smoke curled upward, faint and thin. The horn from the distant tower called once more, 2 short notes confirmation, not alarm. The riders, if they had ever been there, had vanished into the land. The watchman sat again by his fire. The world returned. Silence, though the echo of hooves lingered in his chest. He looked down at the wooden charm in his hand, at the faint line of smoke that drifted toward the horizon. The wall stretched on before him, patient, unending, indifferent. He leaned his back against its stone and watched the light fade. By the time the sun sank, the world was silver again. The torches were lit one by one. The mountains glowed with their faint reflection, each tower a single heartbeat in the vastness of the empire. As night gathered over the plains, the watchman resumed his walk, a shadow among ancient stones, keeping his silent vigil over a land that slept as deeply as it endured. The next night came colder than expected. The day had carried a deceptive warmth, enough to soften the snow in the gullies and wake the smell of dust from the wall's cracks. But when the sun fell, the wind returned. It came from the north, dry and sharp, howling along the spine of the great wall like a living thing. The watchman pulled his fur cloak tighter, his shoulders hunched against the gusts. His torch sputtered, the flame bending almost flat before catching again. The fire in the brazier hissed and flared, sparks vanishing into the black sky. Beyond the parapet, the plains stretched out in unbroken white, the horizon gone, the earth and sky joined into one formless darkness. He had known this kind of night before. It came without warning when the cold seemed to think. The air felt aware, listening, the kind of cold that pressed against the skin not just with wind, but with silence. The hour bell sounded from the nearest tower, one low strike, long and heavy. The iron tone rolled across the mountains, then faded. The watchman counted his breath until it disappeared. He checked the fire again, fed it with more kindling, then walked the length of the wall. His boots ground against the frost. The stones beneath were uneven, slick in places where ice had formed in the cracks. The torchlight flickered across the surface, revealing brief flashes of history, carvings, repairs, patches of brick darker than the rest. Each layer told of men who had come before him, each one standing where he now stood, facing the same wind, hearing the same empty horizon. Halfway along the parapet he stopped. There in the distance a faint glow, not firelight, but something dimmer, lower, pulsing. He squinted into the dark. The light seemed to move, then vanish, then return again. Waited, a heartbeat, then another. Nothing, only the sound of wind sliding down the wall's edge. He turned back toward the tower, his breath visible with each exhale. He could feel the fatigue settling in, that strange, familiar heaviness that came not from the body but from the hours themselves. The night on the wall had a weight unlike any other kind of time. It didn't pass, it expanded, stretching between each heartbeat until it felt endless. At the fire, another guard waited. He was older, with grey in his beard and a deep scar along his jaw. The two men rarely spoke, speech wasted warmth. The older man nodded as the watchman approached. "Light still strong?" he asked. "Yes," the younger one said. "Wind's testing it, though." The older guard grunted. "Wind tests everything." He poked at the fire with an iron rod. Sparks rose briefly, then fell back into the coals. "What did you see down there?" "Nothing certain." the watchman said. Maybe a reflection. May. Older man's eyes narrowed, then softened. There are many tricks out there. The wall keeps most of them away. He leaned back against the parapet, folding his arms. The silence grew between them, not heavy but familiar, a silence that held its own kind of speech. The watchman sat. The fire crackled. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the dry scent of faraway smoke. They both noticed it. The older man sniffed the air once, then twice. "Pine wood," he muttered. "Not ours." Reaching for his spear. His movement was slow, deliberate, the kind that came from years of knowing what not to rush. He walked to the edge of the parapet and looked north. The watchman joined him, lifting his torch. Far below, near the base of the cliffs, a faint orange spark appeared. Then another. Then 3, 4, a broken line of small, moving fires. They flickered like eyes, disappearing and returning again. "Signal fires?" the younger man asked. The elder shook his head. "Too low." "Scattered? Nomads, maybe." He turned, his cloak catching in the wind. "Wake the next tower. We'll light the chain if they move closer." The watchman nodded. He ran to the signal post and lifted the long iron rod that held the flare part. His hands shook slightly as he struck the flint. The sparks fell once, twice before catching on the oil-soaked cloth. The flame rose suddenly, bright, fierce, alive. It cast wild shadows over the stones. The elder guard raised his horn and blew long. The sound rolled down the length of the wall, deep enough to vibrate through the ground itself. A moment later, an answering horn replied from the next tower. Then another, farther away. Fire after fire came to life along the wall, each one joining the next until the mountains themselves seemed to burn with a line of light. The watchman stepped back, his chest rising with each breath. The fires below, those distant orange points, stopped moving. For a long time, neither man spoke. Wind whipped the flames, scattering embers across the wall. "They're watching," the elder said quietly. "From the plains?" "Yes, they always watch first." The younger one swallowed, his throat dry. "And if they come?" The older guard looked at him, eyes calm beneath the rim of his helmet. "Then we do what men on the wall have always done. We light the way for the rest." The torches burned high into the night. The glow of them reached miles into the darkness, visible even from the valleys below. Where farmers slept unaware, hours passed. The lights on the plains never moved again. One by one they dimmed, until nothing was left but cold stars and the red embers of the wall itself. The horn blew once more, the signal to stand down. The fires were doused. Smoke drifted along the parapets, curling into the dawn that was just beginning to touch the mountains. The watchman sat beside the dying coals, his hands black with ash. The older guard poured water from a flask. The steam. Between them, it was nothing, the younger said at last. The elder shook his head slowly. Nothing, or not yet. The wall doesn't sleep for nothing. They sat in silence again, watching the horizon. The sky brightened. The first bird called from somewhere beyond the tower, and as the light spread across the stones, the great wall revealed itself once more, vast, scarred, enduring the breath of an empire drawn in stone. The watchman closed his eyes for a moment. The wind softened. Somewhere, below, the snow began to melt, thin trickles of water finding their way down the slope toward the river. He stood, stretched his stiff limbs, and began his walk again. Each step echoed against the wall, slow, deliberate, eternal. The night had ended, but the watch would never truly end. By the next evening, the cold had eased, but the wind had not. It moved restlessly through the gaps in the wall's stones, slipping between cracks and corners, sighing like a voice that could not quite. Words. The great wall lay in shadow again, the last color of the day fading from its surface. Smoke drifted upward from the brazier towers, joining the darkening sky. The watchman had been awake for too long. The rhythm of night and day had dissolved into something indistinct, a continuous cycle of light, wind, and silence. He no longer counted the hours, only the intervals between the sounding of horns. He walked his post slowly, tracing each uneven line of brick with his. Remind himself that the wall was real, that there was weight beneath his boots, purpose behind his watch. The torch he carried burned low, its light a narrow circle barely enough to see by. Below, the plains were empty again. The snow that had blanketed them was gone, replaced by hard soil that shone faintly under the moon. In the distance, the frozen river had begun to move. Its sound, faint and broken, reached the wall only in pieces, a rhythm of water and ice colliding somewhere. Sight. When the first horn blew from the southern tower, it came not as warning but as routine, a signal to mark the changing of the watch. The sound rolled through the mountains, echoing off stone and snow. The watchman stopped and listened until the echo died, then lifted his own horn to reply. The low note traveled outward, deep and hollow, before fading into the night. The new watch had not yet arrived, and so he waited. He crouched beside the brazier, stirring the coals. Poker! The light flared briefly, illuminating his face, young but worn by weather. His hair had stiffened with frost, the edges white and uneven. He reached for the small wooden charm that hung around his neck, the bird his sister had carved years ago. The firelight glowed in its surface, catching in the shallow grooves of its wings. He rubbed it between his fingers, not in prayer but in habit. Then from the north a new sound came. Low, far away. It was not the wind. He rose slow, holding his breath. The noise came again, faint, rhythmic, like hooves but distant, muffled by the cold. He strained his eyes, searching the horizon. There was nothing, only the pale line of the plain under moonlight. But the sound grew clearer, then faded, then returned. He walked to the parapet and raised the torch. Its light caught the air, scattering in the wind. He saw movement then, small, swift shadows crossing the open ground. A line, not many. Perhaps 5, perhaps 10. He toward the nearest tower and raised his arm, the torch held high. 3 circles of movement, the silent signal for riders. Farther down, a torch waved in response. Then another. The signal chain began again. He lowered the torch and pressed his back to the wall. The wind cut colder now, sharp enough to sting his eyes. He reached for his horn but stopped halfway. The sound of the hooves was gone. He waited. The world below was motionless. The fire beside him hissed. The torch. And then, from somewhere behind him, a single pebble fell from the wall. He spun, spear raised, only silence. The shadows lay undisturbed. The brazier's light flickered weakly against the stone. He held still for a long time. Then he lowered the spear, breathing shallow, listening to the faint hum of the wind moving through the stones. When the next horn sounded, it was closer, the relief watch approaching from the southern tower. 2 men emerged from the darkness, cloaks pulled tight, their faces hidden by the flicker of their torches. Anything? One asked. He shook his head slowly. Sounded like riders, but nothing certain. The man nodded, setting his torch in the holder. The plains play tricks this time of year. The watchman said nothing. He felt the tension leaving him slowly, like breath from a wound. He sat beside the brazier again. The fire had burned low, the coals dim. He stirred them with his boot until a faint glow returned. The new guards took their posts. Voices were quiet, blending into the wind. The watchman stood, pulling his cloak around him. His shift was done. As he descended the narrow stairs inside the tower, the sound of the wind faded, replaced by the still air of the passageway. The stone walls glistened faintly with moisture. The air smelled of soot and salt and smoke, the scent of the wall itself. In the barracks below, a few soldiers slept on mats lined with straw. The room was dim, lit only by the ember of a single lamp. The watchman sat down beside it, his body heavy with fatigue. He unwrapped his hands, flexing his fingers in the warmth. The skin was raw and cracked. He set the wooden charm on the ground beside him, watching its shadow flicker in the lamplight. Above, the horns sounded again, faint, distant and steady, the rhythm of the wall continuing, unbroken. He lay back on the mat, the the sound of the wind reduced to a whisper in the stone. And though his eyes closed, his mind still followed the endless laugh of torches stretching across the night, each one a small, trembling fire holding back the dark. Outside, the wall slept in its own way, not in stillness, but in vigilance. The stones breathed with the wind, the firelight rose and fell, and the river below whispered as it thawed. And through it all, the same silence endured, vast, ancient, and eternal. The silence of a world too large for memory, and of men whose watch never truly ended. The night deepened slowly. The wind that had wall all evening had grown tired now, dropping to small, irregular sighs that curled around the stones and fell away. The stars had sharpened in the stillness, thousands of them, hard points of white scattered across a sky that seemed endless. The watchman woke before his hour. He had not slept long, and the body knew when to rise. The barracks were quiet, a low murmur of breathing, the creak of wood as someone shifted on their mat. He pushed himself upright, his joints stiff, his swollen from the cold. He sat for a while, watching the faint glow of the oil lamp as it guttered on the wall. He took up his cloak, slung his spear over his shoulder, and climbed the narrow stair again. The air changed as he rose, colder, thinner, filled with the smell of ash and stone. By the time he reached the top, the stars had tilted. The horizon was a line of deep blue. The tower was empty except for one guard asleep on his feet beside the brazier. The fire had burned down to him. The watchman knelt, raked the coals together, and fed them dry twigs. The light came back gradually, first red, then orange, then gold. He leaned over the parapet. The world below was still, frozen rivers, ridgelines pale under the moon, the endless plain rolling away into dark. He could hear, faintly, the shifting of ice somewhere far off, a deep, slow sound, like breathing beneath the earth. He walked the length of the wall. His boots left faint prints in the frost that coated them. Intervals, small fires burned in the distance, other towers, other men keeping their watch. The light of each seemed fragile, suspended against the void. He thought of how many centuries these stones had stood, and how many feet had worn this same path smooth. How many winters had passed, how many nameless faces had watched this same horizon and felt the same wind. Halfway down the parapet he stopped. Something gleamed at the base of the wall. It was not firelight, too pale for that. Flickered briefly, vanished, then returned. A reflection, a blade. He narrowed his eyes, holding his breath. The glow moved. Once, twice, then gone. He stood motionless. The air seemed to tighten. The wall beneath his feet felt suddenly immense, heavy, ancient, but not secure. He strained to listen. No sound. No hoofbeats, no voices. Only the faint, rhythmic creak of the wind against the stones. He waited a long time. When nothing followed, he let out the breath he had been holding. Fingers lingered on the spear's shaft. At dawn, the plain revealed itself again. The frost glittered in the light, 1,000 small mirrors scattered across the earth. The glow he had seen in the night was gone. Only the pale skeleton of a dead tree stood near the base of the wall, its branches thin and bare. He turned away. Down below, the camp was waking. Smoke rose in thin trails from the cook fires. The faint clatter of pots carried upward. Somewhere, a mule brayed, the sound sharp and lonely in the cold. When the sun broke over the eastern hills, it struck the wall full on. The stones that had been grey moments before now burned gold. The cold retreated a little. The air smelled of iron and thawing soil. The watchman stood still, his eyes half closed against the light. His breath drifted upward, white in the warmth. He felt something close to peace, not joy, not relief, but the quiet awareness of having endured another night. He lowered his spear, rested it against the parapet, and watched the sunlight spread across the towers, one by one. Each burst of gold marked another post, another man awakening, another life contained within the same endless rhythm. At the farthest edge of sight, the wall curved out of view, folding into haze. It might have gone on forever. The horn sounded once low, resonant, final. The watch was ended. The watchman descended the steps again, the sound of his boots echoing against the stone. He passed through the shadowed hall into the warmth of morning. Behind him, the wall glowed softly in the rising light, immense, ancient, unmoving. The fire in the brazier still burned, its smoke twisting upward, lost to the wind. And far below, where the plain met the horizon, the river broke free of its ice at last. Its water glimmered under the sun, winding toward the unseen sea. The great wall stood as it always had, patient, silent, alive. And the men who guarded it, their names already forgotten, carried, fading into the next like sparks vanishing into dawn. The days that followed blurred together, indistinguishable in their silence. The great wall stretched across them like a thought too vast to finish, a single line of stone winding through the spine of the earth, outlasting memory, outlasting men. The watchman rose before dawn each morning. The routine had become its own kind of prayer. The cold basin of water to wash his face, the tightening of the cloth around his hands, the creak leather as he fastened the straps of his armor. The same narrow stairway led him upward each day, the same smell of ash and frost waiting at the top. He no longer felt the cold as pain. It was simply a fact of being, something that lived in the marrow and stayed there. The wind, the hunger, the endless quiet, all had faded from discomfort into rhythm. The wall was alive in that rhythm. The torches burned in sequence from tower to tower, each flame a pulse in the long artery of empire. Stationed along it were small, but they were many, and their stillness bound the distance together. From above, it might have looked like a single creature breathing, a slow, deliberate respiration of fire and silence. He walked the parapet as the stars began to fade. The horizon was a faint grey bruise above the mountains. Below him, the world was empty, only the frozen plains and the soft gleam of the river winding through them. The air carried no scent, no sound, nothing that hinted of life beyond these stones. He stopped beside the brazier to warm his hands. The coals glowed deep red, slow and steady. He stirred them, watching the ash shift in small grey clouds. A faint trail of smoke rose and was taken by the wind. His companion, the older guard, approached from the far side of the wall. His steps were slow, deliberate. Frost clung to his beard, his cloak stiff with ice. He set his spear against the stone and sat beside the fire. "Quiet," the younger said. Elder reached out, feeding the brazier a few pieces of kindling. The wood crackled. The sound felt almost strange after hours of stillness. "How many nights have you stood this post?" the younger asked. The older guard shrugged. "Too many to count, not enough to forget." They sat in silence. The wind hissed over the stones, carrying faint whispers of snow across the parapet. In the distance, the chain of towers shimmered faintly under the growing light. The younger one looked out toward the horizon. "Do you ever think of what lies beyond it?" The older man smiled faintly. "Only when the nights are too long. But out there is nothing that concerns us. The wall is our world." The younger nodded slowly. He wanted to believe that, to find comfort in it, but something in him still strained toward that horizon, toward the vastness that the wall was meant to hold back. He remembered the stories told in the barracks of riders who vanished into the plains, of fires that appeared, disappeared in the dark, of songs in languages no one could name. He had never seen such things, but the idea of them pressed against his mind, like the distant hum of thunder before a storm. The older man seemed to sense it. "There are things the wall was not built to stop," he said softly. "Wind, time, memory, those pass through no matter how thick the stone." He rose, his joints cracking in the cold. "Keep the fire alive. I'll check the southern post." When he was gone, the watchman, alone again. The world around him was beginning to brighten, faint bands of color bleeding through the sky, thin lines of gold cutting across the stones. The fire's glow dulled in the new light. He turned the small wooden bird in his hand, tracing its wings with his thumb. The surface had grown smooth with wear, its edges darkened by the oils of his skin. He wondered if his sister still kept the matching carving she'd made for herself. He wondered if she remembered the sound of his voice. The horn sounded once from the northern tower, a brief, low note. He lifted his head, a signal, not an alarm, the call for inspection. He rose, brushed the frost from his cloak, and began walking toward the tower. The stones were slick beneath his boots. The wall curved gently with the shape of the hills, its line disappearing into a thin veil of fog that clung to the valley below. When he reached the next post, 2 soldiers were already there. They stood over a section of broken brick. Severe, just a crack where the mortar had given way. They worked quietly, filling it with gravel and new clay. The sound of their tools was soft but comforting, a human noise against the immensity of the wind. The watchman helped them finish the repair, then stepped back to watch the fog drift below. The land there looked endless, ridges upon ridges of pale earth fading into grey. One of the men followed his gaze. "You stare out there long enough," he said, "and the land starts to stare back." The others laughed quietly, but not unkindly. The watchman smiled, though the words stayed with him. By midday, the sun had cleared the mountains. The wall shimmered with light, gold on grey, a band of warmth across a frozen world. The fire in each tower smoked thinly upward. The smell of roasting grain drifted from the barracks below. For a moment, the silence seemed almost tender. That evening, as dusk returned, the watchman stood once more at his post. The air had calmed. This burned with colour, crimson fading to violet, then to the deep blue of night. The stars appeared one by one, the same as they had the night before, the same as they would long after he was gone. He lifted his torch and lit it from the brazier. The flame caught easily. Its light spilled across the wall, revealing the roughness of the stone, the small scars of time and weather. He walked the length of the parapet until the wind took the flame and made it bow. From the tower ahead, another torch answered his light, then another, stretching far into the darkness, a line of fire running through the heart of night. He paused, listening to the rhythm of the wind and the faint, distant sound of water below. He felt for a brief moment that the wall was breathing with him, that the stones themselves were alive, holding memory in their silence. He turned his face to the horizon. The dark plains were invisible now, but he could sense their weight beyond the edge of sight. Somewhere out there, men like him tended other fires, watched other skies, and waited for morning. The great wall glowed faintly in the starlight, a river of stone winding through eternity. And the watchman, one small heartbeat among its endless echoes, stood guard as the night descended once more. The torchlight flickered, the wind whispered, and the world turned, slow, patient, eternal. The next night, the wall seemed to shift beneath the watchman's feet. The wind had died down, and the cold seemed less like a force of nature than an old companion, one that had grown familiar and quiet with age. The air was clearer, though still sharp, and the vastness of the plains stretched out beneath the stars like a waiting sea, still and unmoving. The watchman took his usual place by the brazier. The flames were low tonight, struggling slightly against the windless air, but they held steady. He crouched near it, warming his hands. The firelight flickered against the stone, creating sharp shadows that danced like figures from another time. The wall ahead was a line of darkness against the night, the towers flickering intermittently with firelight as each post lit their torches in turn. The rhythm of the flames along the length of the wall was familiar, reassuring. He walked the length of his section, each step heavy in the silence. The stones beneath his feet were cold and damp from the evening dew. He stopped at each watchtower, checked the condition of the torches, the strength of the fires. The air was still, save for the occasional creak of wood settling and the sound of his own boots grinding against the stone. In the distance, the stars twinkled with an intensity that made the watchman pause. He could see their light reflected off the distant walls of the wall, where torches glowed like faint stars in the dark. The faint light seemed endless, stretching across the plains in a thread of fire and stone. As he continued his rounds, a faint, far-off cry. On the wind, he stopped. The sound came again, distant, unclear, almost like the call of a bird or the cry of something larger. The wind carried it, twisting and bending it, but the direction of the sound was uncertain. He held still, listening, but nothing came after, only the usual hum of the wind, the distant whispers of the earth. He looked toward the horizon, toward the plains, his breath visible in the light. There was nothing, only a faint stretch of snow, the dark shape of the mountains in the far distance. The sound was gone, as though it had never existed. Still, his heart beat a little faster. There was something about this night, about the faint echo of that cry, that unsettled him. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong to the wall, that didn't belong to this place. He turned back toward the nearest post, feeling the weight of the night settling more heavily on him. He walked a little faster, his footsteps now quick and deliberate. The feeling didn't leave him, though, the strange sensation of being watched, of being in a place that stretched too far to feel safe. The next tower, as always, was unmanned, and the torch burned low. He added more kindling, and for a moment the flame flared high, illuminating the rough stone and the stark sky beyond. He let out a slow breath, watching the flame fight against the night. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow darting against the darkness. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. Tightened around his spear, he waited, breath held, but the shadow didn't return. Another quiet night, another shift. He moved on. The wind picked up again, this time from the east, bringing with it a chill that carried the faint scent of something, what, he couldn't place. It was something foreign, something wild. He passed the watchtower on the farthest end, his boots clicking sharply against the stone as he moved toward the southern section. There was nothing unusual, nothing to raise an alarm, but the weight of something unfamiliar was still heavy on his chest. As he reached the tower nearest the southern gate, he found the guard already there. The man had been waiting for him, his spear leaning against the wall, his cloak pulled tight against the cold. The fire burned lower here, just a faint red glow in the small brazier. "You feel it?" the older man asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the horizon. The watchman nodded. "Something's not right," I heard. A cry, just far off from the plains. The older guard didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the empty landscape, his eyes narrowing. "You know what's out there," he muttered. "The wilds, the wolves, the nomads." The watchman didn't reply. His fingers tightened around his spear. No, this was different. A voice, eh? Call. The older man grunted, his breath visible in the air. Could be a trick. Don't give the wind too much credit, or the night. But the watchman was not convinced. He stood beside the fire, watching the shadows stretch out across the stone, watching the flickering light play tricks along the surface of the wall. The wind howled again, this time from the north. The mountains seemed to shift in the distance, the air thick with the feeling that something was watching, something was moving. "We'll wait for the signal," the older man said, his voice quiet. "But keep your eyes sharp." The watchman nodded, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the plains. He felt it again, that strange presence, as if the night was too vast, too empty to allow for peace. A low horn sounded in the distance, then another, the signal moving along the wall like the passage of time, like a pulse through the stone. But still, the air felt heavy with expectation. He stood still as the wall beneath his feet. The stars above had begun to fade, the faintest light appearing on the horizon. The night, at least, was almost over, but something in the silence, in the movement of the wind, made him uneasy. Something was coming, something he couldn't see, and for the first time in a long time he could feel the weight of the unknown pressing against him. The fire burned low beside him, its light struggling against the shadow, and the great wall stretched on, dark and silent, into the vast, uncertain night. The dawn came slowly, as it always did, creeping over the distant hills, touching the stone of the great wall with a soft and pale light. The watchman had stood there for hours, eyes fixed on the land beyond, waiting for something that he knew might never come. The fire beside him had dwindled to embers, the light of it fading, just as the strange feeling in his chest seemed to evaporate into the stillness of the morning. He had not heard the cry again. The shadows that moved across the plains had not returned, and yet the air remained thick, as though the earth itself held its breath. The watchman looked toward the horizon again, squinting against the first rays of sunlight. The land was barren as it always had been. The plains were empty save for the occasional gust of wind stirring the dust into brief whirlwinds. He stood there, waiting and waiting. It was only when the first horn sounded, a low, slow note, that he tore his eyes away from the distance. He turned toward the sound, his hand tightening on the spear at his side. The call came from the northern tower, then echoed across the wall. Another signal. Another change of the guard. The first time that morning, the tension in his shoulders eased. He had expected something else, something more. The land beyond the wall had been still, but for that single moment of unease, that fleeting sound he couldn't explain. He glanced down at his hands, still clenched, still poised for something. What, he wasn't sure. A moment later, the relief watch appeared, 2 guards walking briskly along the parapet, their footsteps breaking the silence. Their faces were tired, but their eyes were sharp, as they always were when they took over for those who had stood through the long, cold night. The younger of the 2, a man who had been in the service of the wall only a few seasons, nodded at him. The night was quiet, the watchman nodded slowly. Too quiet. The younger man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. His eyes moved to the horizon, just as the watchman's had done so many times before. The same view, the same stillness. The older man, slower to move, dropped his claw around his shoulders as he approached. "You saw something?" he asked, his voice low, the kind of voice men used when the wind was harsh and the dark never seemed to end. The watchman hesitated. "I heard something." The older guard looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and began walking toward the southern section of the wall, his hands clasped behind him. The younger guard followed him. "A bird or a wolf?" he asked. The watchman shook his head. "Neither. It was clear, too human." The younger guard's eyes darted toward the distant plains once more, his hand resting on his sword. "Strange." He said it quietly, as if speaking it aloud might make it real. The watchman didn't reply. The words felt too heavy to speak. He knew that, just as the wall had always been, this silence, this watch, was too large to explain. Words never made it small enough. He walked back to the brazier. The coals had settled again, the fire nothing but for the iron poker, pushing the ashes aside, trying to revive the flame. The crackle of the wood beneath the fire was comforting, a soft, rhythmic sound against the overwhelming quiet. As the fire began to catch again, the distant horns sounded once more, 2 short calls. The watchman did not turn this time. Instead, he focused on the steady rise of the flames. The wall had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. The guards, the posts, the torches, all of it was part of a movement that wouldn't stop. That was the only truth he had. The young guard returned a moment later, his spear in hand. "They've been asking about the patrols on the far side," he said. "Nothing unusual." The watchman nodded. "Good." His eyes wandered back to the northern horizon. The wind had picked up again, but it had brought nothing with it. No riders, no signs, no sounds, just emptiness. The vastness of the land stretched before him like an unspoken promise. It would remain like this, silent. Just as the first light of day touched the top of the tower, something shifted in the air, a slight change in pressure, in sound. The watchman froze, his hand resting on the brazier. The air felt different, not warmer, not colder, just different. From below, the sound of horses reached his ears. Faint at first, then clearer, heavy hooves striking the frozen earth, their rhythm breaking the monotony. The distant gallop grew louder, closer. His heart skipped. "Riders," he murmured. "Heater." To the other guards, his eyes wide. "Get the signal ready." The older guard nodded. "It could be nothing, but we must be sure." The younger guard moved swiftly to the far post. His feet barely made a sound against the stone. The watchman stood still, listening intently. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer still. And then, from the northern horizon, he saw them, shadows against the pale light, moving fast, too fast to be travelers. "They're here," the watchman whispered, though the words came without certainty. The riders were closing in fast, their shapes now clear against the cold grey sky. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods and heavy cloaks, their steeds black and wild, charging over the plains as though they had been waiting for this moment to arrive. The watchman reached for his horn. The call had to go out, quickly. The chain must be lit. But even as he lifted the horn to his lips, he knew the sound of it would reach no one in time. The riders were here, and they were not the ones who waited. They were the ones who came for the watchman. The horn never sounded. The watchman's breath caught in his throat as the first of the riders crested the ridge below the wall. They came fast, their movements smooth and silent, like shadows gliding over the earth. The light of dawn had not yet reached their faces. Only the glint of metal, spears, blades, ornaments flashed in the half-dark. For a long moment, the watchman could not tell if what he saw was real. The silence of the plains swallowed the world. The hooves struck the frozen ground without echo. The wind had stopped. Then one of the horses reared, releasing a shrill, cutting cry that broke the spell. The sound ripped through the morning air, echoing up the stone face of the wall. "Signal fire," the older guard barked, already moving. His voice was calm, deliberate, but his eyes burned with urgency. The younger soldier fumbled with the flint, his hands shaking. Sparks scattered, caught the oil-soaked cloth, and the pot of fire roared to life. The smoke rose thick and black, curling skyward. Almost at once, a second fire answered it from the next tower, then another. The signal moved one post to the next as if the wall itself were waking. But down below, the riders did not retreat. They were too close. The watchman leaned over the parapet, spear in hand. He could see their faces now, not a horde, but a dozen at most. Leather and fur armor, painted, strung across their backs. They rode with purpose, but not chaos. This was not a raid. It was something colder. One of them stopped, a tall man with a cloak of wolfskin draped over his shoulders. He dismounted slowly, looking up at the wall. For a moment his face caught the light. He was not old, but his eyes were dark, and they did not move. He stood perfectly still, watching. The watchman felt his breath steady. He had seen men like this before, scouts, messengers, outlier. Beyond the Empire's reach, they came close sometimes, testing the border, measuring the silence. But this one did not test. He waited. The older guard joined him at the parapet. "They're not attacking." "No," the watchman said. "They're watching." Below, the tall man raised his hand. Not in peace, not in surrender, simply an acknowledgement, a movement meant to be seen. The older guard leaned forward, his voice low. "He knows we're alone." The watchman said nothing. He could feel it too. Quiet knowledge, like the breath of the plains pressing against the wall. This was no invasion. It was a reminder. The man below lowered his hand and turned. He mounted his horse again, and with a short, sharp cry, the riders wheeled and vanished into the mist. No dust, no echo, only the faint imprint of hooves left in the frost. The world fell still again. For a long time, none of them moved. The younger soldier still held the torch, his hand trembling. The older guard let out a long breath. They wanted to be seen. The watchman nodded. They wanted us to remember they're still out there. He leaned against the parapet, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. Below, the frost glimmered faintly in the new sunlight. The world looked unchanged, but something in it had shifted, a tension too quiet to name. The older guard straightened. "We'll keep the fire burning till the next tower confirms. Then we'll report to the captain." The younger man lowered the torch, his face pale. "Do you think they'll come back?" The older guard's gaze stayed on the horizon. "The wall isn't what keeps them out," he said softly. "It's the space between, the silence. When that silence breaks—" He let the words hang unfinished. The watchman turned his eyes north again. The plains stretched endlessly, a pale ocean beneath the sky. The riders were gone, but he could still feel their presence, the faint impression they had left on the world. He knew they would come again. Not tonight, not soon, but someday when the wind turned, when the wall had grown tired, when men forgot to be afraid. The smoke from the signal fire drifted upward, curling into the dawn. The horns along the wall called once, then twice, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. And the watchman stood there, his spear beside him, his heart still echoing with the sound of hooves. By midday, the plains were empty again. The fire had burned low. The guards had returned to their routines, theirs restored. But when the watchman looked out once more toward the north, the air seemed heavier, the light thinner. He reached into his cloak and felt for the wooden bird. It was warm from his hand, smooth, familiar. He turned it once slowly as the wind returned, whispering against the wall, slipping between the stones, carrying faint traces of dust from the far plains. And somewhere, beyond the edge of sight, that same wind moved through a line of riders who had already disappeared, their shadows folding back into the horizon. The watchman closed his eyes. The wall breathed. The fire crackled softly, and another night began. The final night came without warning. It arrived like all others, quiet, pale, the air thin with frost, yet there was a stillness deeper than before, a kind of waiting that lived within the stones. The great wall stretched endlessly into the dark, its torches flickering like a chain of dying stars. The watchman stood alone at his post. The older been reassigned to the southern barracks that morning, and the younger one had fallen ill, his cart empty, his armor folded neatly by the fire. The wall belonged to him now, his breath, his fire, his silence. He watched the plains below, his eyes tracing the faint scars of frost where hooves had once marked the ground. There was no movement, only the slow drift of snow across the earth, whispering in tiny spirals. The wind carried a strange calm tonight. It no longer howled, no, against the stones. It moved softly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The fire burned low beside him, its warmth barely reaching his hands. He held the wooden bird in his palm, turning it once more between his fingers. The edges had worn smooth from the years of touch. He remembered the sound of his sister's laughter, faint and distant now, like an echo carried on the wind. He closed his hand around the charm and tucked it inside his cloak. A faint sound broke the quiet. Nah. The rustle of soldiers, but the slow, rhythmic creak of leather and metal. He turned his head, his hand instinctively reaching for the spear. From the shadows of the stairway, a figure emerged, one of the night captains, his face half hidden beneath the rim of his helmet. His cloak trailed behind him, edges stiff with frost. "You're still awake," the captain said. The watchman nodded. "Sleep doesn't come easily on nights like this." The captain stepped to the parapet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The riders haven't been seen again," he said quietly. "Scouts found only snow, no tracks, no campfire ash, nothing." The watchman followed his gaze. "They were there." "I don't doubt it," the captain said. "But sometimes the land takes things back. The plains erase what doesn't belong." They stood together, side by side, in silence. The wall groaned faintly beneath them, the sound of stone expanding in the cold. "How long have you served?" the captain asked after a time. "Winters." "Long enough to know," the captain said, "that the wall remembers everything, even what men forget." He turned then, his armor whispering softly, "Keep your fire strong. Dawn will come sooner than you think." When the captain descended the stairs, the sound of his boots faded into the hollow belly of the tower. The watchman remained, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. The night deepened. The stars turned slowly across the sky. The line of torches flickered and swayed, their flames. Bowing to the wind, he sat by the brazier and closed his eyes for a moment. The warmth on his face felt like memory, not of this place, but of summers long gone, of riverbanks and sunlit fields. The sound of water, the smell of wet earth, the laughter of a voice he could barely recall. When he opened his eyes again, the fire had burned lower and the stars had dimmed. The sky was no longer black, but a faint blue-gray, the color that comes just before dawn. He rose slowly. Feel. His armor, the ache in his hands. He walked the length of the parapet one final time. Each step echoed softly against the stone. The wall stretched before him, endless, patient, alive. At the far end he stopped and looked north. The land was vast, pale, untouched. The wind had stilled completely. He could almost imagine the riders there again, standing just beyond the horizon, silent, watching as he had watched them. But they did not come. They never would. The first light of morning. Over the mountains, gold spilling across the stones. The torches burned faintly in its glow, their flames losing strength as the sun took hold. The watchman laid his spear against the wall and reached into his cloak. He took out the wooden bird and set it on the parapet beside the brazier. Its carved wings caught the light, glowing softly. He stood for a moment longer, eyes on the horizon, then turned and began his descent down the narrow stairway. The sound of his boots faded into this, swallowed by the stillness. When the next guard arrived, he found the brazier cold, the fire long gone. Only the little wooden bird remained, resting on the parapet, its surface warm with sunlight. And beyond it, the wall stretched on, a river of stone and silence, dividing the living from the forgotten, holding its breath as another day began. The wind returned at last, soft and low, moving through the cracks of the old bricks like a whisper. And the great wall, ancient, patient, eternal, kept its watch,